Hi folks, Adam Andrews here from CenterForLit with another small contribution to a great conversation. Today's topic, how do you know when a book is a classic? The best lit teachers rely on classic books, but how can you tell a classic from a non-classic? One popular answer to this question is that you have to wait, because it takes time to identify one. You must wait and see which books manage to transcend the concerns of their own time and place and speak to the hearts of people from other times and places. Which books, in other words, address universal themes in universally compelling ways. This idea is well known among lit teachers, and it's widely applied as the 100-year rule. A book cannot be declared a classic until it has persisted in relevance for at least 100 years. Well-meaning teachers often use this rule to exclude 20th century literature from the high school curriculum. We have an obligation to read the time-honored works of the ancients, they say, but since Ernest Hemingway wrote during the lifetime of our grandparents, his books have much less to teach us, and therefore create no such obligation. We put a true idea to an absurd use when we apply the 100-year rule this way. It amounts to making a judgment about the quality of a work based on its age alone. Worse, it implies that classic works take on some extra quality with the passage of time. It forces us to conclude that Dante's Inferno was something less than a classic from 1320 to 1420, by which time it had finally changed into one of the greatest insights into human nature ever written. This is not a rational basis for judging literature. Should high school seniors in 1620 have avoided Shakespeare simply because the world hadn't yet decided on his place in the canon? Did Hamlet's wisdom suddenly appear in 1720 in the same verses where it had presumably been absent for a century? It's indisputable that great books stand the test of time, but this is not the same as saying that no recent book is great. The Aeneid was great from its first day in 19 BC. The 100-year rule is descriptive of old classics, but should never be used to evaluate more recent ones. This only postpones a true reckoning of their worth. Granted, Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms is not yet 100 years old. It is 93 years old, which forces those of us who reject it to plan for an uncomfortable day 7 years from now. On what basis can we reject it then if we use the 100-year rule to reject it now? The real problem, of course, is not that Hemingway's books are too recent. The real problem is that we don't like what they say. We complain that Hemingway's writing is depressing, his philosophy atheistic, and his characters morally repugnant. It's not that we can't yet tell whether he says anything important. It's that we think he's saying something evil. And this troubles us so much that we put Hemingway and other 20th century authors on an index of godless books that have no value to our students. I think our anxiety about 20th century literature has its roots in a faulty philosophy of reading, and of art, and of education. As good parents and teachers, we want our kids to grow up wise and virtuous, and we press literature into this service by mining the classics for characters to emulate. We elevate moral virtue as the highest principle of literary art, and imitation as the highest pedagogical technique, and therefore approve of works which lend themselves to the teaching of moral virtue by imitation. Since works which do not fit this paradigm are useless to us, we deride them as defunct and corrupted, and eliminate them from the curriculum. And since nobody can become virtuous by imitating a Hemingway hero, his stories are the first to go. But this isn't what literature is for. It's not why authors write. It's not why readers read. And it's not how teachers ought to teach. Dante did not write the Inferno to frighten us into keeping our noses clean. He wrote to describe the contours of human nature and to create a community of fellow sufferers of human weakness. Shakespeare didn't create Hamlet to help us avoid indecision. He wrote to marvel at the mass of contradictions that make up a man, including both his potential for glory and his appetite for destruction. Homer did not compose the Iliad as a warning against the sins of self-seeking and of bitterness. What solution could he possibly have offered, knowing nothing of the God of grace, who alone can empower righteous conduct? No, Achilles exists so we can gaze in wonder at the glorious mess that is mankind and feel in our own hearts a kinship with the plight of all men everywhere. There was no need for Homer to coerce his hearers into virtuous resolutions to go and be just like Achilles. The whole point of the Iliad is that you are just like Achilles, which is both the problem and the glorious beauty of the whole thing. Ernest Hemingway and his contemporaries did for the 20th century what Dante did for the 14th, and what Shakespeare did for the 16th, and what Homer did for the 8th century BC. He wrote from a different culture than they did, with different mores and different assumptions running behind his work, but he strove for the very same goal: to lay before his readers, in all its glory and tragedy, the crisis of the human soul as he saw it. He strove to speak for his time and place about the condition of man in all times and all places. In this way, the works of Hemingway and Waugh and Eliot and Chesterton and Fitzgerald and Steinbeck and Faulkner and Solzhenitsyn and Lewis and dozens of others are the Hamlets of their era, the Iliads of the 20th century. We ask too much of our literature. We demand that every story be a sermon, that every written thing speak as Holy Writ. Literature is not so. Written by fallen man for fallen men, the most it can ever do, in Shakespeare's immortal phrase, is hold the mirror up to nature and show us ourselves in the clear light of art. Fortunately, this self-knowledge is the first step on the road to virtue. Where endless models for emulation will eventually create a self-righteous Pharisee, true depictions of human nature can make a humble, empathetic man. 20th century lit may be thin on moralistic models for emulation. It was not a particularly moral time. But it teems with powerful depictions of the human situation that our students need to understand. They live in a world created by the 20th century, after all. They will hear Hemingway's doubts, fears, and questions raised by their neighbors and their friends, perhaps even echoing in their own hearts. They have been born into this age by the will of God, and this is the age they are called to serve. Empathy for the plight of the world in their own time is the highest goal of education. They must know the great books of their own time to have it. Now, many of these works will eventually pass the 100-year test, of course, and become classics. But that'll make no difference to our students. Now is their only chance. And the great books of the 20th century will never be greater than they are today. Yes, you say. So what's the list? What books are truly great? How can you tell a classic if you don't use the 100-year rule? Well, I think, despite its flaws, the goal of the 100-year rule is a good one: to see which books manage to transcend the concerns of their own time and place and speak to the hearts of people from other times and places. In other words, to address universal themes in universally compelling ways. This is really the heart of what makes a classic a classic. If a work raises a question that the human family has worried over and discussed and batted back and forth, as it were, since the beginning of human civilization, and the artist treats that idea, treats that universal theme in a profoundly compelling way that makes readers of all stripes respond to it, you may have a classic on your hands, regardless of how recently it was written. These criteria, the compelling treatment of universal themes, can be applied to any book in the world by any reader in the world who is familiar enough with themes and treatments to make an educated judgment. So it's really more important to know how to make a list of classic books than it is to have a list of classic books in your hand. I'm not trying to avoid the question, of course, only to suggest that you, the individual reader, are in a better position to answer it than I am, because you're the one that will be doing the reading. Is Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy a classic by this definition? How about Rowling's Harry Potter? Who will decide? I say the conversation itself is the most important thing, for it leads us all back into the works themselves to partake once more of their delights and to know ourselves more fully in the process. Well, that's all for today. I hope you've been provoked into conversation. Meanwhile, like and subscribe for more. And if you're interested in joining the conversation at CenterForLit, Click the link in the description below. Happy reading, everyone.